think what we're seeing is quite an interesting range of developments nationally as the education system is having to rethink relationships, roles and working patterns. And clearly the issue of leadership is at the core of all of this. And I think what we're seeing now is a move towards new, more localised initiatives. And of course this is quite challenging to everybody in the system. It's challenging to people in schools, for example, because it implies new roles for them, not least head teachers. It's challenging, I think, for government because what I see as a rather natural instinct to want to centralise has to be changed. And interestingly, and in a way that often is not mentioned, there's a big challenge here for the role of local authorities. What should they be doing in order to coordinate locally developed responses? I'm very centrally involved in the City Challenge movement, and you know that we have the London Challenge, which has been an enormous success. The transformation of London secondary schools, which has included a very powerful leadership strategy, has led to considerable improvements in secondary schools in London. Now, building on that project and the success of that project, we now have a continuation and an expansion of the London Challenge. We have similar activity in the Midlands, in the Black Country, and here in Greater Manchester we have the 10 local authorities working together. Now, I think that City Challenge movement is quite radical and will be looked back historically as a very important turning point because it is about working in new ways and it does require new relationships. Now, within that movement, I think it is very clear, and all our research would confirm that the power of this is collective effort, and that collective effort has to involve many stakeholders, obviously the staffs of schools, but also communities, local business, religious organisations. Really, it's a collective effort at a community level. Now, this is potentially empowering for people who are in leadership roles within education, not least head teachers, but it's also very challenging. And looking at it as we do in our research through the eyes of head teachers, of course it creates for them strategic dilemmas. Their first priority, their moral duty, is to do everything possible for today's children as they go into the classrooms to experience their lessons. What we're now saying is, as well as doing that, as well as making sure that is of the highest quality, your task now is to take on quite a senior role in terms of coordinating this collective community effort to link education to economic, social development. I think that the recognition that we need to do something different has increasingly led to the idea that we need local analysis and local strategies. The development of certain attitudes and skills, particularly amongst senior colleagues, people who are prepared to experiment and take risks, and sometimes that's quite difficult when you're in a very challenging circumstance. I think people whose instinct is to want to work with other people. So one of the things we notice, for example, is that schools that collaborate with other schools do so because they've learned the power of collaboration within their own organisations. So because they know that within their own organisations that better teamwork, better collaboration creates a capacity for change and improvement, it's a natural extension for them to say, well, if we're doing this within our organisation, can't we do it with other organisations, with other schools, but also with community organisations, local businesses, universities. I think this kind of instinct for working with other people, with other groups, is something which is essential to this kind of way of working. If you think about it, what we know about competition is that it creates winners. And the only way you can create winners is by actually creating losers. Now, in some fields that doesn't matter, but in the field of children's lives and education, it is morally unacceptable. So what we're exploring is the way in which competition can be used to create that edge that I referred to, whilst at the same time recognising that collaboration is the means of stimulating creativity in such a way that we make sure that no children miss out. The worrying sign of our English education system is that as we have continued to improve the quality of the education system over the last 10 or even 20 years, we have continued to leave large groups of children and young people behind. Now, we compare our system with other countries of the world, and we think particularly of Finland, Canada, South Korea. These countries seem to have been able to achieve excellence and equity. We're getting there in terms of excellence, but we stand, I'm afraid, a long way behind in terms of equity. So clearly what we need to do in thinking about new patterns, new forms of leadership, is creating ways of working which really do stand behind the principle that every child matters, and in my view, every child matters equally. The senior people that we've looked at who are involved in these experiments don't seem to fit into any profile. I guess an instinct would be to think, oh, these are all superheads, charismatic people who are obviously driving things forward. And I'm afraid that's become part of the rhetoric over the last few years. And to be honest, it's not a sustainable way forward. If we're going to base the improvement of our education system on having more and more dynamic, charismatic leaders, we're quickly going to run out of steam. I don't think this is about creating a personal profile of individuals. Rather, it's looking at patterns of work and saying, what can we learn from these patterns that might be replicated? The pattern we've noticed is a tendency for head teachers in particular to be drawn away from day-to-day school activity. Now clearly that's quite a worry, because a well-established pattern in the school effectiveness research is to say that successful head teachers are very much head teachers who focus on high-quality teaching and learning in that respect. The idea of the maintenance development dilemma is that any organisation going through a period of change has the problem of continuing to maintain what it already does at a reasonable standard, whilst at the same time investing in its future. Now, it is a dilemma because there's no right answer. If you only concentrate on maintenance, you're not taking your organisation forward. Equally, if you put too much attention to development, then you damage the maintenance of what already exists in the school. So there's no right answer. But what we've seen in a number of the schools is how the renegotiating of roles, particularly in the senior leadership teams, is beginning to deal with that, whereby inevitably head teachers are to some extent being drawn away from the day-to-day issues of teaching and learning, but where that's opened up spaces for deputy head teachers, assistant head teachers, middle leaders to take on new roles in terms of taking collective responsibility for all of that. But it does create tensions, and in a number of the schools we went into, in interviewing some of the members of the staff, occasionally people did talk about their worries that the head teacher seemed less concerned about things to do with school uniform, discipline, children hanging about at the front gate and smoking and so on. You know, the idea that members of staff like to feel that the head teacher is part of that and acting as part of the system to give confidence to everybody in that respect. The research that we are doing is in contexts where the innovations that we are looking at are still at the very early stages. And I think it's dangerous if we try to make premature judgments as to what are the lessons of these experiences. And I think there's always a kind of an instinct, particularly amongst policymakers, to want to look for ready-made solutions. Having said that, we see some very interesting patterns that are emerging, which are a source of encouragement. These patterns really are about establishing new working relationships within schools, new working relationships between schools, and especially, I think, new working relationships between schools and their communities. Now, when we look particularly at the most challenging circumstances in our education system, it seems to me this is a very promising way forward. And that's why I think we have to continue to experiment, and we have to continue to draw the lessons from this research.